Unemployed, he said it like it was a punchline, and the room decided it was funny before I had a chance to answer. There were 12 of us at the table, maybe more if you counted the ones standing near the kitchen island pretending not to listen but absolutely listening, and when he laughed, they followed, not because it was clever, but because it was easy. I picked up my glass of iced tea, the condensation cool against my fingers, and I smiled the way you do when you're not interested in correcting people. Not exactly, I said, calm, even, the kind of answer that doesn't give anyone what they're looking for. He leaned back in his chair like he had just won something, like labeling a person was the same as understanding them. My sister glanced at him, then at me, then back at her plate. She didn't interrupt. She never did when things were comfortable for her. My mother let out a small laugh, polite, the kind that tries to smooth over edges but ends up sharpening them instead. My father said nothing at all, which, in our family, had always been its own kind of agreement. So what do you do then? He asked, louder this time, turning slightly so the others could hear, could stay involved, could enjoy the show he thought he was putting on. I took a sip of my tea before answering, not because I needed time, but because I wasn't in a hurry. I never am. I work, I said, and set the glass back down in the same spot, perfectly aligned with the edge of the napkin. A few people chuckled again, softer this time, confused laughter, the kind that isn't sure what it's reacting to. He smirked. Right, he said, dragging the word out, must be nice. I nodded once. It is, I replied, still polite, still measured, the kind of tone that makes people feel like they're missing something without knowing what it is. He tapped his fork lightly against his plate, a small metallic sound that cut through the room for a second. I mean, no pressure, no deadlines, just drifting, he added, glancing around for approval. Someone across the table smiled too quickly. Someone else looked down. My sister shifted in her seat. I folded my hands in my lap, steady, relaxed, the same way I had learned to sit through conversations where people thought they were defining me. The same way I had learned to let them. Drifting requires a current, I said softly, almost to myself, but loud enough that the words landed. He frowned, just for a second, like he had heard something he couldn't quite place. What's that supposed to mean? He asked. I met his eyes, not challenging, not defensive, just present. It means, I said, with a small, courteous smile, people only drift when they don't know who's actually steering. There was a pause then. Not long. Just enough to change the air. My mother cleared her throat. My father adjusted his napkin. My sister reached for her glass and missed it slightly before correcting herself. He let out a short laugh, trying to pull the moment back into something he could control. Well, he said, I guess we'll find out eventually. I nodded again. Eventually, I agreed. And I left it there. Because I didn't explain. I never explained too early. And because in rooms like this, timing is everything, and I had already decided I would let them laugh first. I did not respond after that. I let the moment settle the way dust settles after something small breaks and nobody wants to admit they heard it. Conversations resumed, but not the same ones. They shifted, slightly off rhythm, like music played a fraction too slow. My sister's boyfriend kept talking, filling the space with stories about his work, his plans, his projections, numbers that sounded impressive if you did not look too closely at them. He spoke in clean sentences, confident ones, the kind that expect agreement before they finish. People nodded. They always nod when confidence sounds like certainty. I watched him the way I watch markets, not for what is said, but for what repeats. Patterns matter more than words. I just think everyone should be doing something real, he said at one point, turning his fork slowly between his fingers. You know, something that actually contributes. He did not look at me directly this time. He did not need to. The table understood the direction. My mother gave a small, approving hum. My father shifted in his chair, then reached for the bread basket like timing could make him invisible. I reached for the napkin beside my plate and adjusted it, smoothing the corner that had folded under itself. Contribution is a matter of perspective, I said gently, not interrupting, just placing the sentence into the space he had created. He smiled again, thinner this time. Sure, he replied, but there are still basics. Basics. It was an interesting word. It assumes everyone is standing on the same floor. I tilted my head slightly, considering him, the way you consider a question that has already answered itself. And what would you define as basic? I asked, polite, genuinely curious in tone if not in intention. He straightened a little, pleased to have the floor again. Stability. Income. Something you can point to, he said, gesturing lightly with his hand, as if the air could hold proof. Something people respect. There it was. Respect. The word people use when they mean recognition. The word they reach for when they have not learned the difference. I nodded once. That makes sense, I said, and I meant it. It made sense for him. It made sense for the version of the world he understood. My sister finally spoke, her voice light, almost rehearsed. Tige has always been independent, she said, choosing the word carefully, like it might shift if she pressed too hard on it. Independent was what my family called me when they did not know how to explain me to other people. It was safer than silence. That is one way to put it, I said, smiling at her, giving her the courtesy of agreement. She relaxed slightly, grateful for the bridge. My mother leaned forward then, resting her elbows near her plate. We just want you to be secure, she said, her tone soft, concerned, the kind that sounds like care but carries expectation underneath. You know that, right? I met her eyes, steady. I do, I answered, and I did. Wanting something for someone is not the same as understanding what they already have. My father finally spoke, his voice quiet but present. What exactly are you working on these days? He asked, not confrontational, just curious enough to be noticed. The table shifted again, attention redirecting. Waiting. I looked at him, then at my mother, then at my sister, and finally back at the man who had started this, who was watching me now with a kind of interest that had replaced his earlier amusement. I folded my hands again, calm, centered. A few things, I said, letting the words rest without detail. He let out a small laugh under his breath. Of course, he said. Of course. It was always of course when people did not get the answer they expected. I did not correct him. I did not elaborate. I simply reached for my glass again, took another sip, and set it down in the same place as before. Because not every question deserves an immediate answer. And not every room is ready to hear one. My name is Tige Monroe. I do not say it often in rooms like this, not because I am hiding it, but because names carry weight, and I have learned to place mine carefully. I work with numbers, but not the kind that sit still on spreadsheets waiting to be explained. I work with movement. With decisions. With the quiet space between what people say they value and what they actually choose. That is where the real numbers live. I noticed a long time ago that most people only look at what is visible. A paycheck. A title. A schedule they can point to and understand. It makes them feel comfortable. It gives them something to measure. I do not blame them for that. Measurement feels like control. But control is rarely where people think it is. I grew up in a house where certainty was assigned, not earned. My sister was the one people introduced first. The one whose plans were discussed over dinner like they were already achievements. She is going to do something big, my mother would say, even when there was nothing specific to point to. My father would nod, not because he disagreed, but because agreement was easier than evaluation. I was the other version. The steady one. The one who did not need attention because I did not ask for it. When I brought home good results, they were expected. When I stayed quiet, it was appreciated. Silence fit me in their version of the story. I learned early that explaining yourself to people who are not asking the right questions is a slow way to disappear. So I stopped explaining. I started observing instead. Patterns at the dinner table. Who spoke first? Who interrupted? Who decided what mattered and what did not? It was never random. It never is. You always keep things to yourself, my sister said once, years ago, leaning against the kitchen counter while I stood by the sink. She was smiling when she said it, but there was something else underneath. Something that wanted an answer. Not everything needs to be shared, I told her, drying my hands with a towel I had folded too neatly. She laughed then, light, dismissive. You make it sound like you have secrets. I looked at her, calm. Everyone does, I said. She did not ask what mine were. She never did. Back at the table, her boyfriend was still talking, still building himself sentence by sentence, unaware that repetition had already started to work against him. He mentioned risk. He mentioned growth. He mentioned opportunity. Big words. Clean words. The kind that sound impressive until you ask where they land. I mean, you have to be willing to take chances if you want to get anywhere, he said, glancing at me again, like he was inviting agreement but expecting silence. I gave him neither. That depends on what you define as a chance, I replied, my tone even, respectful, the way you speak when you are not trying to win, just to clarify. He leaned forward slightly. Putting something on the line, he said. Actually having something at stake. I nodded, considering the phrasing. That is one way to see it, I said. Because there are many ways to put something on the line. Some of them just do not look like risk to people who only recognize noise. My father watched me then, more closely than before. My mother followed his gaze. My sister looked between us, sensing a shift she could not name. And her boyfriend, for the first time that evening, paused before speaking again, like he was beginning to realize that the version of me he had decided on was missing something. I lifted my glass once more, steady, unhurried. Because the truth about timing is simple. You do not reveal it when people ask. You reveal it when they start to listen. I learned to build quietly because noise attracts attention, and attention invites opinions that rarely understand the work behind them. Years ago, when I first started, nobody asked what I was doing. They assumed it was temporary. They assumed I would settle into something they could explain to their friends over dinner. Something with a title that fit neatly into a sentence. I let them assume. It saved time. I remember one afternoon in my small apartment, the kind with thin walls and a window that looked out at a parking lot instead of anything worth naming. I had a laptop, a notebook, and a table that wobbled if you leaned too hard on one side. That was enough. It had to be. My sister had stopped by that day, unannounced, as she often did back then. She walked in, looked around, and smiled in that careful way people do when they are deciding how honest they want to be. You are still figuring things out, she asked, setting her bag down like she was only staying for a moment. I closed my notebook slowly. I am working, I said, the same answer I gave now, years later, at a much larger table. She nodded, not convinced, but not interested enough to ask further. Well, she said, glancing at the window, just make sure you have a backup plan. I remember thinking that people who talk about backup plans often do not realize they are already living theirs. I did not say that out loud. I rarely do. Instead, I smiled. I always do, I told her. She left 15 minutes later, unconcerned, confident that whatever I was doing would eventually resolve into something she could understand. It did. Just not in the way she expected. Back at the dinner table, her boyfriend was still speaking, but there was a slight hesitation now, a fraction of a second before each new statement, like he was checking the ground before stepping forward. It was subtle. Most people would not notice it. I did. So what is the end goal? He asked, folding his hands together, his tone shifting from performance to inquiry, though the edge was still there. Everyone is working toward something, right? I considered the question, not because it was difficult, but because it deserved a precise answer. Clarity, I said. He blinked. Clarity, he repeated, like the word had landed somewhere unfamiliar. I nodded. Knowing exactly what something is worth, I explained, my voice steady, measured. Before anyone else tells you what it should be. He leaned back again, slower this time. That sounds abstract, he said. It was not criticism. Not fully. More like uncertainty dressed as dismissal. It is, I replied, unbothered. Until it is not. My mother shifted in her seat, her fingers lightly tapping the side of her glass. I just hope it leads somewhere stable, she said, her concern returning, more visible now. Stability again. The word came back like it always did. I looked at her, softening my expression, because she was not trying to diminish me. She was trying to understand a version of security she had never seen. It already has, I said gently. She paused, her hand still. What do you mean? She asked. The table quieted again, not abruptly, but gradually, like a conversation stepping back to listen to something else. I glanced down at my glass, at the thin ring of condensation it had left on the table, then back up. I mean, I said, choosing each word with care, not everything stable looks familiar. My father exhaled quietly, a sound so small it almost disappeared. My sister watched me now, more directly than before, her expression shifting from casual to curious. And her boyfriend, for the first time that evening, did not interrupt, did not redirect, did not fill the silence. He just looked at me, like he was beginning to understand that the conversation he thought he was leading had already moved somewhere else. And I let it stay there, just long enough for the room to feel the difference. The room did not return to what it was. It could not. Something had shifted, small but permanent, like a chair moved half an inch that no one acknowledges but everyone feels. My sister's boyfriend picked up his glass, took a sip, and set it down more carefully than before. The confidence was still there, but it had edges now. Edges tend to show when certainty is no longer uninterrupted. So, he said, clearing his throat lightly, if things are already stable, why keep it so vague? It was a fair question on the surface. It sounded reasonable. It was also an attempt to bring the conversation back to a place he understood. I nodded once, acknowledging the effort. Because clarity is not always for everyone, I replied, my tone even, not dismissive, just precise. He frowned slightly. That sounds selective, he said. It is, I answered. No hesitation. No apology. Across the table, my mother shifted again, her fingers now still against the glass. My father leaned back in his chair, watching, not intervening, but no longer absent. My sister looked between us, her expression tightening just enough to show she was no longer comfortable. I just think, her boyfriend continued, leaning forward a little, if you are doing well, you should be able to explain it. Otherwise, people will assume things. I smiled, small, polite. People always assume things, I said. Explanation does not change that. It only changes who feels validated. He let out a short breath through his nose, almost a laugh, but not quite. So you are just going to let people think whatever they want, he asked. I lifted my glass again, watching the light catch along the rim for a brief second before answering. I let people think what they are ready to think, I said. It saves everyone time. There was a pause. Longer this time. Not uncomfortable. Just unfamiliar. Someone near the end of the table adjusted their chair. The sound was louder than it should have been. My sister finally spoke again, her voice softer now, less certain. You have always been like this, she said, almost to herself. I turned toward her, my expression gentle. Consistent? I offered. She hesitated, then nodded once. Yes, she said. Consistency is another word people use when they do not fully understand something but have learned not to question it too loudly. Her boyfriend exhaled, leaning back again, trying to reset the tone. I mean, no offense, he added, though the sentence came after the intent, not before it. But it just seems unclear. I tilted my head slightly, considering him with the same calm attention I had given everything else that evening. Unclear to you, I corrected softly. Not sharp. Not confrontational. Just accurate. He held my gaze for a second longer than before, like he was deciding whether to push further or let it go. That moment matters more than most people realize. It is where conversations either escalate or evolve. He chose something in between. Maybe, he said, a little quieter now. Or maybe you are just very good at avoiding the question. I smiled again, this time with a hint of warmth that had not been there earlier. Or, I said, setting my glass down in the same place, very careful about when to answer it. My father's eyes flickered toward me, just for a second. My mother looked at him, then back at me. My sister's posture shifted, her shoulders lowering slightly, like something had settled that she could not name. And her boyfriend, for the first time that evening, did not respond immediately. He looked at me, really looked this time, like he was starting to understand that this was not a conversation he could win by speaking more. And I let the silence stay, steady and unbroken, because sometimes the most precise answer is the one you have not given yet. The silence held longer than anyone expected. Not awkward. Not forced. Just present. The kind of silence that makes people aware of themselves in ways they did not plan for. My sister's boyfriend shifted in his chair again, his fingers tapping once against the table before stopping, like he had caught himself mid-thought. He looked around briefly, as if checking whether the room was still on his side. It was not as certain as it had been earlier. Well, he said finally, his tone lighter, attempting to recover ground he was no longer sure he had. I guess some people just prefer to keep things private. I nodded slightly. Some things are built that way, I replied. Not defensive. Not proud. Just factual. He gave a short laugh, but this time it did not carry. It fell flat, like a line delivered too late. My mother reached for the serving dish in the center of the table, offering more food to fill the space, but no one immediately responded. My father adjusted his posture, leaning forward just a little, his attention no longer divided. My sister glanced at me again, longer this time, her expression no longer dismissive, but searching. So you were saying, her boyfriend continued, slower now, more careful with each word, that what you do is significant. It was not quite a challenge. Not quite respect. Something in between. I looked at him, steady. I am saying, I answered, that significance is usually decided after the fact. He frowned slightly, like he was trying to follow a thread that kept moving just out of reach. That sounds like a convenient way to avoid being specific, he said. I allowed a small smile, not amused, but patient. Or a precise way to avoid being misunderstood too early, I replied. That landed differently. Not heavy. Just enough. The room quieted again, but this time it was not because of tension. It was because people were starting to listen with intention instead of expectation. My father cleared his throat softly, not to interrupt, but to enter. Have you always worked like this? He asked, his voice measured, genuinely curious now. I turned toward him, softening slightly. Yes, I said. Even when it did not look like work. He nodded slowly, absorbing that, not dismissing it. My mother looked between us, her expression shifting from concern to something closer to reconsideration. I just wish we understood it better, she said quietly. I met her gaze, gentle. Understanding comes with context, I told her. And context usually arrives late. My sister's boyfriend exhaled, leaning back again, but not with the same confidence as before. This time, it was more thoughtful. So when does the context arrive? He asked, not mocking, not pressing, just asking. I paused for a brief moment, letting the question settle fully before answering. Usually, I said, right when people think they already have the full picture. He nodded once, almost unconsciously. The edge was gone now. Not replaced by agreement, but by awareness. That is usually the first step. Across the table, someone's phone vibrated briefly against the wood surface. A small sound. Easy to ignore. Except it was followed by a second one. Then a third. My sister glanced down at her phone, then back up, her expression shifting. My father's phone lit up next. My mother reached for hers, hesitating for a fraction of a second before checking the screen. I did not move. I did not reach for anything. I simply sat there, hands folded, posture relaxed, watching the room adjust in real time. Because sometimes context does not arrive through explanation. Sometimes it arrives all at once, without asking for permission. My sister looked down at her phone again, this time not pretending it was nothing. Her thumb hovered over the screen, then tapped once, then stopped. That is strange, she said quietly, almost to herself. My mother glanced at her. What is it? She asked, her voice careful, like she was not sure if she wanted the answer. My sister hesitated, then turned the phone slightly so my mother could see. There is an article, she said. Something about a deal, a company acquisition. My father reached for his own phone again, this time more deliberately. The glow from the screen reflected faintly in his glasses as his eyes moved, scanning faster than before. That is not just an article, he said, his tone lower now, more focused. That is a major transaction. Across the table, someone else spoke up. I just got the same alert, they said, scrolling. It says the lead strategist closed it this morning. My sister's boyfriend leaned forward slightly, his earlier confidence replaced by curiosity he could not hide. What company? He asked, reaching for his own phone now, unlocking it quickly. My sister read from the screen, her voice slower than usual. Monroe Advisory Group, she said. The name landed softly, but it did not stay soft. It moved through the table, through the silence, through the small shifts in posture and expression that followed. My father looked up first. Not at the phone. At me. Just for a second. Then back down. My mother's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. Monroe, she repeated, almost instinctively. My sister's boyfriend's brow furrowed as he read, his lips moving slightly as if repeating the words to himself. Lead strategist. T. Monroe, he said quietly, the sentence losing its structure as it left his mouth. There was a pause. Not the same kind as before. This one was different. This one had direction. My sister looked up at me then, her expression no longer uncertain, but searching for confirmation she was not ready to ask for directly. That is, she started, then stopped. I did not move. I did not reach for a phone. I did not correct anyone. I simply sat there, hands folded, the same as before. Because nothing had changed. Not really. Only their understanding had. My sister's boyfriend looked at me again, longer this time, the earlier tone gone completely. Is that you? He asked, not loud, not performative, just quiet and precise. The room waited. Not for an explanation. For alignment. I met his gaze, calm, steady, the same way I had all evening. It is part of what I do, I said. No emphasis. No pause. Just the answer. My mother exhaled softly, a sound she did not seem aware of making. My father leaned back slightly, processing, recalibrating something internal that had been set years ago. My sister looked down at her phone again, then back at me, her expression shifting into something new. Not disbelief. Not confusion. Recognition. You closed that? She asked, her voice quieter now, stripped of the casual certainty it had carried earlier. I tilted my head slightly, offering a small, polite smile. I helped structure it, I replied. Because accuracy matters. Especially in moments like this. My sister's boyfriend sat back slowly, his posture no longer leading the room, just existing within it. He nodded once, almost unconsciously. That is significant, he said. The word came back. Different this time. It did not sound like a test. It sounded like a realization. I reached for my glass again, the condensation ring slightly wider now, the surface of the table marked by time in a way that could not be undone. It depends on the perspective, I said gently. And I let the sentence rest there, exactly where it needed to be. No one reached for food anymore. Plates sat untouched, the steam fading into something thin and unimportant. The center of the table had shifted without anyone announcing it. My sister's boyfriend looked down at his phone again, scrolling slower this time, not searching for confirmation, but for context he had missed. This says the deal was valued at over 80 million, he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. The number did not echo the way he expected. It just stayed there, heavy and precise. My father folded his hands together, resting them on the table, his posture no longer passive. That is not a small operation, he said, his voice measured, almost analytical now. My mother glanced at me again, her expression softening in a way I had not seen before. Not worry. Not assumption. Something closer to respect, still forming. My sister shifted in her seat, her earlier certainty replaced by careful attention. Why did you not tell us, she asked, her tone not accusing, just genuinely uncertain, like she was trying to find where the missing pieces had been all this time. I met her gaze, steady. You never asked the right questions, I said gently. Not to correct her. Just to place the truth where it belonged. She paused, absorbing that, her eyes dropping briefly to the table before lifting again. My sister's boyfriend exhaled slowly, setting his phone down in front of him, screen still lit. I assumed, he started, then stopped. The sentence did not finish because it could not. Assumptions rarely survive contact with reality. I gave him a small, polite nod. Most people do, I said. No edge. No judgment. Just acknowledgement. He looked at me again, this time without the earlier performance, without the need to lead the room. I should not have said what I said earlier, he added, his voice lower now, more grounded. The apology was not dramatic. It did not need to be. It was enough that it was real. I tilted my head slightly, offering a calm smile. You said what made sense to you at the time, I replied. Because that is usually the truth. My father glanced between us, then back at me. You built all of this on your own, he asked, the question carrying weight he had not placed there before. I considered it for a moment. Not alone, I said. But quietly. He nodded slowly, understanding more in that one word than in anything I could have explained years ago. My mother's fingers relaxed against the table, her posture easing in a way that suggested something had resolved internally. We just did not see it, she said softly. I met her eyes, gentle. You saw what you expected to see, I answered. She held my gaze for a second longer, then nodded once, accepting that without resistance. My sister looked at me again, her expression no longer searching, but settling. You always knew where you were going, she said, almost with a hint of admiration she did not try to hide this time. I gave a small smile. I knew what I was building, I corrected, lightly. Because direction and construction are not the same thing. My sister's boyfriend leaned back slightly, his posture finally still. That is more than most people can say, he admitted. The room did not respond with laughter this time. It responded with silence that meant agreement. I reached for my glass again, the same motion as before, the same placement when I set it down. It is just a different kind of work, I said, my tone calm, almost reflective. And this time, no one questioned it. Because the room had already shifted. And there was nothing left to prove. The conversation did not return to normal, but it softened. That is the difference people rarely notice. Things do not go back. They settle into something new. My mother reached for the serving dish again, this time with intention, placing food onto my plate without asking, the way she used to when I was younger, before expectations had replaced attention. You should eat, she said quietly. It was a small sentence. It carried more than it sounded. I nodded once. Thank you, I replied, and I meant it. My father looked at me again, not briefly this time, but fully, like he was recalibrating years of quiet assumptions into something he could finally understand. You did well, he said. Simple. Direct. No decoration. That was his way. I held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod. I did what needed to be done, I answered. He accepted that without adding anything. That was new. Across the table, my sister shifted closer, her posture no longer guarded. I think I misunderstood you, she said, her voice softer than I had ever heard it in a room. Like this. I turned toward her, my expression calm, open. You understood the version that was visible, I replied. She let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. I should have looked closer, she admitted. I smiled gently. You will, next time, I said. Not as a correction. As an invitation. Her boyfriend sat quietly for a moment, then leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. The performance was gone. What remained was something more honest. I spend a lot of time trying to be seen, he said, almost thoughtfully. You seem to do the opposite. I considered that, not dismissing it. I focus on being understood, I said. Visibility tends to follow when it matters. He nodded slowly, absorbing that in a way he had not absorbed anything earlier that evening. I misjudged you, he said. This time, there was no hesitation. I met his eyes, steady, not holding the moment longer than necessary. You made a quick decision with limited information, I replied. It happens. He let out a small breath, the tension leaving his shoulders. Still, he added, I was wrong. I tilted my head slightly, offering a calm, reassuring smile. You adjusted, I said. That matters more. The table settled into a quieter rhythm after that. Conversations resumed, but they moved differently now, with pauses that held meaning instead of avoidance. My mother asked me a few more questions, not to confirm what she thought she knew, but to actually listen. My father contributed where he could, not to lead, but to understand. My sister stayed engaged, her attention steady, her tone thoughtful. And her boyfriend spoke less, but when he did, he chose his words more carefully. At some point, the glasses were refilled. Plates were cleared. The light above the table softened as the evening moved forward. I remained the same. That was the part no one said out loud. Nothing about me had changed between the beginning of the night and the end of it. Only their perspective had. I reached for my glass one last time, the condensation now gone, the surface dry, the circle it had left behind faint but still there if you knew where to look. I glanced around the table, at each of them, not with judgment, not with distance, just with clarity. You were right earlier, I said finally, my voice calm, even, the same tone I had used from the start. My sister's boyfriend looked up, surprised, unsure which part one meant. I held his gaze for a brief second. Not everyone works the way you expect, I continued, a small, polite smile forming. Some of us just do it quietly. And this time, no one laughed.